This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
Make it stop. Next on Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deeper in the corner. Waits for it. Is caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison. Brady gets terrific. Throws it and a touchdown. Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him. And a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris hacks a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team, and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again.
Merry Christmas, Go Blue. I'm Steve Deace. Welcome to this week's episode of Michigan Podcast right here on YouTube, where we need to make it stop. I'll talk about that here in a second. But first, I want to thank all of you that make this possible each and every week. Our friends at Detroit Sports Podcast, which help to spread the word about the audio podcast each week on iTunes. All of you that subscribe on iTunes and right here on YouTube that leave us positive reviews, positive comments, and even the negative ones. We're thankful for all of you. You can also follow us on Michigan Podcast on Twitter to keep up with what we think throughout the course of the week in between episodes. Want to thank all of you that help us reach some really important benchmarks since we started this just on a whim. As a big Michigan fan a few months ago, and we have been very pleased with the steady but consistent growth of Michigan Podcast, and all of you have made it possible. So thank you. Go Blue, and help keep spreading the word, subscribing, encouraging others to do the same, posting positive reviews on iTunes and YouTube. All of it is greatly appreciated. However, we have to begin with something that I can't even anymore. And I hate to go all snowflakey here, but I can't even. Last night broke me. Watching us blow a 20-point lead in Columbus to then lose by 9. To shoot 17% in a half. I got to believe if we just grabbed 10 intramural players at the University of Michigan and had them shoot half-court shots for a 20-minute running clock, they'd make 17% of them, okay? I just had to get up and walk away. And my son, watching the game with me, my 10-year-old son, Noah, was like, what's the big deal? Which made me angrier, because he lives and breathes Michigan. But to him, the Ohio State game isn't a big deal at all. He's 10. He doesn't know a rivalry. He only knows beatdowns. So we might as well be playing Duke in basketball and Alabama in football when the other team's Ohio State, where Noah's concerned. I mean, he's not worked up anymore. He's like, we just lose to them in everything. What's the big deal? It's the way of things. It's the order of the universe. The old man, though, I had to get up and walk out. And when I walked out, I went on the computer, decided to do some research. Is it really as bad as I think it is? So it's not, because it's worse. It's much worse than I thought it was. Since 2003, it's almost 15 years ago. 15 years ago, I still had a 4-head. Now I'm working on the 5-head. 15 years ago, I was like 150 pounds fatter than I am right now. Had just actually bought my first home. First child was 2. I now have 3 kids, and the youngest is 10. My career just getting started. No one had owned a smartphone yet 15 years ago. Warner Brothers hadn't ruined the Justice League yet 15 years ago. We still thought we could bring peace to the Middle East 15 years ago. And since 2003, I can't even say this. Give me a minute. We are 13-34 in football and men's basketball combined against Ohio State. 13-34. 13-34. 13-34. How is that possible? If we actively didn't try to win, by random occurrence, could we win? Could we go 6-41? Probably. But we tried to win, allegedly. And went 13-34 against Ohio State. How is that possible? The mind cannot even conceive. I've had so many Ohio State fans tweeting me since I posted this at Michigan Podcast on Twitter last night because they couldn't believe it either. They're like, hey, we know we've been kicking your ass, but we're actually starting to pity you now. That's the worst, by the way. When your rival pities you. When it's not even fun beating you anymore because it's like oxygen. It's just there. Moving on to the next one. 13-34. 13-34. Steve, it's just one team. Why is it such a big deal? Well, if you want to know, they've had one of their best eras in men's basketball ever since 2003. Thank you to Thad Matta for most of that. They've been on one hell of a run in football. So guess what? If we're going to be victors valiant, champions of the West, or in this case, the East, guess who we got to go through? Yeah, that team in scarlet and gray. It's been more like 50 shades of scarlet and gray. And at this point, you're only watching Michigan play Ohio State if you're a sadomasochist. You just like pain. See Ohio State on the schedule, you know what today's forecast is. Today's forecast? Pain. Maybe we should just preemptively forfeit. Spare us all the new ways we'll invent to lose to them. 14-0 leads in football, 20-point leads in basketball. How about we just get annihilated and not show up? How about Ezekiel Elliott boat races us in our own stadium? How about we watch referees slapping Mike Weber on the ass? I still want that one referee, that shot of Curtis Samuel scoring the winning touchdown in 2016 and that look of orgasmic euphoria that Ohio referee has on his face. Man, when I go home tonight, I want my wife to look at me the way that referee's looking at Curtis Samuel. Right? We've invented ways to lose to these guys in everything that matters. And in the last 15 years, it's 13-34. Make it stop. Ward Manuel, Jim Harbaugh, John Beilein, great Michigan men, all very handsomely paid and deserving of it looking at their resumes. So I'm not making it an unreasonable request, and I think I speak for every Michigan fan out there when I say, make it stop. Again, want to thank those of you that are helping to support what we're doing on our Patreon page, patreon.com/Michigan Podcast. And yes, I'm going to keep providing bonus content for our Patreon supporters. And even now that football season is mostly over, we still have the bowl game to go against South Carolina. In fact, after the game against UCLA, the basketball game on Saturday, I'll do a little bonus podcast for our Patreon subscribers there. So make sure that you stay with us this entire time. And if you want more content, hey, it takes resources to do this. So the more support we get at Patreon, the more likely we are to be able to produce more content here at Michigan Podcast in the future. Back here on Michigan Podcast, joined again this week by Michael Spath of the Michigan Insider and WTKA in Ann Arbor. Go Blue, Michael. How are you?
I'm doing great today, Steve. It's certainly been an interesting couple of days, but have rebounded and back into a good, happy place.
Good, because I'm not. So last week I was in a good place and you weren't. This week you are and I'm not, so we're yin and yanging here very well.
Okay.
Here's I've got a couple laments. One of them I just spent several minutes opening the show venting. Since 2003, I went and looked it up last night. I did the math. I went season by season, basketball, football, added it up. Since 2003 in football and men's basketball, we are 13-34 against Ohio State.
Wow.
13-34. My 10-year-old son who lives and breathes maize and blue, he doesn't understand this whole big deal with Ohio State. Just another game to him. He's like, well, to him, Ohio State might as well be, it's like playing Alabama. Well, we already know we can't win. He doesn't get all worked up. He's not nervous, doesn't understand why his old man cares so much. He doesn't know this is a rivalry. He knows this is the team that beats us and everything. 13-34. How the hell is that possible, Michael? How could, if we didn't try to beat them in 47 meetings, random occurrence, do you think we might win 13 times or at least come close to that? How is that possible?
Maybe you should have added women's softball in there.
Well, hell, we can't beat them in hockey now. That's our own sport. We're the Alabama of hockey. We can't beat them in hockey anymore either. Can't beat them in that sport either.
I don't have a great answer for you. I mean, the crazy thing is that out of those 13 wins, 12 of them belong to the basketball team, right?
Yes.
Just one for the football team in 2011. And no, I mean, I understand your frustration, your anger. I mean, yesterday's basketball game was 100% there for the taking. Michigan's winning by 20 points, loses by 9. So you saw a 29-point swing in the final, 24 minutes of the game. It's kind of inexcusable. It's to me, and I've said this on the show a couple of times, the youth argument worked for football. I don't really think it works for this Michigan basketball team when at any given moment you have two seniors, one a fifth-year senior in Duncan Robinson and Muhammad Ali Abdul-Rahman on the floor together. You have a junior in Mo Wagner, who's supposed to be your best player. You have a redshirt sophomore, so a third-year player in Charles Matthews that is supposed to be your most talented player. And then if you have Xavier Simpson on the floor as a sophomore point guard, I mean, you can't really use the youth argument as why this Michigan basketball team has struggled in some of these tough games. And yesterday, I saw this stat, and I'll give credit to the Wolverine.com because they're the one that's had it. But from 1:43 to go in the first half to 16 seconds to go in the second half, so whatever that is, 22 minutes or so, your top four scorers, Duncan Robinson, Muhammad Ali Abdul-Rahman, Charles Matthews, and Mo Wagner, did not have a single basket in 22 minutes as this lead evaporated. I don't have words to defend that. Last year, I jumped off of the John Beilein bandwagon, and then when they went on the run, I made the promise that I will not.
As did I. I took a pie in the face for my kids. Yeah, because I did that. I thought we needed to make a change. Yeah, I made the mistake too.
But I can still be frustrated with how the team performed yesterday. Still be disappointed in some of the performances by individual players, and that's where I'm at right now. I'm not worried about John Beilein. I'm not worried about him making this team better. But what I'm starting to do is change the ceiling of what I thought this team could be, and that's kind of what I did with football this past year. Is right now, I went into the season, I thought it could be a Sweet 16 team and be a top 4 in the Big Ten. I'm looking at it now, and I'm thinking probably closer to 6th or 7th in the Big Ten. And if they get past the opening game of the NCAA tournament, I'd be surprised and impressed at this point.
The 13-34, and that game last night, 17% field goal shooting. I think if we had a running clock for 20 minutes and every member of the team stood at half court and just launched shots, they'd make 17% of them from half court, I think, in 20 minutes in a running clock. I mean, that's incredible, okay? But the 13-34 against Ohio State, is there something systemic happening there? Do they just care more than we do? When I look at the renovations done to Chrysler, the place is gorgeous. When I look at the football facilities and stuff we have, what is that's a systemic level of dominance. And really, from a financial standpoint, really the only two sports that matter in terms of your bottom line, the ones that are driving your overall profit margin. And they're the other program in your own conference that you are measured by and considered your chief rival. How does something like that happen? I don't think we can just chalk that up to the ebbs and flows that we've seen historically in the Michigan-Ohio State rivalry. There's something, to me, that's got to be systemic going on there, doesn't there?
I don't know how to describe it in basketball because you're really looking at two head coaches in basketball. Tommy Amaker, who was a very nice coach, a good coach, but never was able to get this program over the hump. And then John Beilein, who has gotten this program over the hump, has gone to a Final Four, has been, won Big Ten titles, won Big Ten tournaments, has been to multiple Sweet 16s, a couple Elite Eights. I mean, so I don't know. And I think if you break it down and you have the numbers, I'm sure basketball, while disheartening, is not as bad as the football record looks. I mean, basketball, they've got at least 12 wins out of those games. The 34 losses They're probably 22 of them, 23 of them are in basketball. And so you're talking about, it's frustrating, but I'm not really overly concerned about basketball as much as I'm concerned about football. And I don't just throw my hands up in the air and say, oh, well, you had Rich Rodriguez, who's a bad football coach. Because was Rich Rodriguez a bad football coach? I mean, he was successful beforehand. He's, again, fairly successful afterwards. Brady Hoke in over his head. Jim Harbaugh is still building. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, Steve. It's depressing. And certainly when you look at Michigan State, this is a conversation point we had on our show on Tuesday, is Mark D'Antonio has found the perfect gasoline for his program for a decade, and that's been Michigan football. That's been the disrespect. That's been the little brother. That's been always, comparing himself to those guys. That's been his fuel for the fire has been Michigan. What has been, in the last decade, what has been Michigan's fuel? That's the question I asked on our show today. I think that's your systematic problem right there is we have not been able to, whether it's been Lloyd Carr, the last couple years of Lloyd Carr, or the 3 years of Rich Rodriguez, or the 4 years of Brady Hoke, or the first 3 years of Jim Harbaugh, to tell me at any point in those last, 6, 10, 14 years, out of those last 14 years, what did Michigan stand for? What was it that they hung their hat on? What was there that they were trying to be as a program? It's been a lot of things, and it's been nothing. And I think that's the biggest part of this is that Ohio State, and at least in football, has always been about beating Michigan, the same thing that Michigan State has always been about. Michigan hasn't really been that. And I don't really know why. It used to be that way, but we haven't had this urgency, this focus on Ohio State, this focus on Michigan State like we should have. And I think that's the reason why those two programs, everything that they do, they circle that Michigan game. It means everything to them. But listen to the coaches, the last 4 coaches that Michigan's had in football, and how often they don't talk about their rivals unless it's brought up. And even then they kind of say, we want to beat these guys and the whole thing. Mark D'Antonio talks about Michigan all the time. Urban Meyer and Jim Tressel talk about Michigan all the time. Michigan talks about Ohio State sometimes. That's the difference right there.
It's a good segue to where I want to go next because, the hullabaloo over Harbaugh and D'Antonio's tweeting back and forth. I'm not much of a smack guy. I'm the kind that likes to let the final score do the talking and get the satisfaction from that. But what's bothered me this entire football season, several things bothered me. But at times it seemed like, and I love Jim Harbaugh. Okay, it was my favorite player growing up. But it seemed like he was on tranquilizer darts during a lot of this season. He seemed it's like those old Keith Olbermann sports centers, Rich Kotite, stoic. I mean, just stoic, docile. I didn't see a lot of that fire we've typically seen. I think we saw it really for the first time in the Ohio State game. I don't know if he decided to dial it down because he thought he was being targeted by refs, the new rules about staying in the box. He wanted to show more patience for such a young team. I don't know. But that's why I love the tweet that he sent yesterday. Whether I would have worded it differently, worded it better, I could care less about that. Because that's Jim. Not what we've seen this past year, with the Belichickian non-quoting quotes and the standing on the sidelines with no reaction at all. That to me seemed contrived. I know the Iowa State athletic director very well. Jim interviewed for the job at Iowa State when he was still at San Diego. And the thing that, Jamie Pollard, when he told me the story about Jim interviewing for that job, the fire, the passion, the enthusiasm that he brought with him into the job interview, saying to Pete Carroll, running smack so Pete Carroll looks at him at the end of the game, what's your deal? The showdown that he had with the old Lions coach, after beating UCLA, this is why Rick Neuheisel doesn't like him. He walked right out there after they're running up the score and said, how'd you like that one, Ricky? Now, to me, that's who he is. When you hired him as your coach, You were signing on for some of that. And I think that did bring some swagger to a team from the Hoke era where we hugged Mark D'Antonio and apologized for celebrating over their stadium or at their stadium before the game. I think that was some much needed swagger. I actually think with the youth we had on our team this year, I think we needed that swagger even more than we needed it with Jordan Lewis and Jake Butt, and those guys were already established players. And I think that was something missing. I'm all for it, man. I think we need more of that. I think that gets us to where you want us to be, where we aren't taking this crap. We're not rising above it anymore. We're not, well, we're better than that. No, we're not better than that. We're getting our asses kicked, and somebody better do something about it. And if we can't do anything about it on the field, then by golly, we're at least going to do something about it on Twitter and show we're tired of taking it. I'm all for it, 100%, even if I would have worded it differently or not, because that's actually who Jim is, and I think it was missing much of this football season, Michael.
Well, I think that's a fair argument. I think that's something that a lot of people have suggested is that, it's funny because, I was helping to design a T-shirt, and one of the T-shirt designs we had was a trash can with a whole bunch of clipboards in it that were smashed, and it was supposed to be Jim Harbaugh and the way that he, coaches been here type of thing. But that wasn't the guy that we saw this year. I can't recall, and maybe you can, but I can't recall a single episode all year where he smashed his clipboard on the sideline or threw it up in the air or did anything like that.
All the officiating calls we didn't get this year, we have all those stats about how we don't get it. In 2 years, we have led the conference in tackles for loss and sacks. In passing situations in 18 Big Ten games, we've gotten 2 holding calls on the opposition. In 18 Big Ten games, where's the fury? Where's the fire? That's Jim. I think it's been missing this year.
Yeah, and certainly I think when you look at it, again, that's a criticism. That's an argument that a lot of people have made. Is it true? I'm not really certain. But I'll say this. Back to your comment about the tweet and you want to see Jim Harbaugh be Jim Harbaugh. I would agree with you that when they come out and play this Outback Bowl, I want to see that guy on the sidelines.
Yes.
I don't care if he is fiery on Twitter. I care if he's fiery during football season. That's where my whole thing keeps on coming down to this is I don't care about the off-season tweeting. I don't. I want to see that same energy, that same edge, that same competitiveness, that same ferocity, all those things on the football field. So don't tell me, don't say like, hey, he's winning the off-season war. Win the in-season battles. That's what matters to me. But I would love to see if you're right that he's been missing, that he's kind of tampered himself down, but maybe it's starting to come back. Well, then we'll get a pretty good chance on January 1st when they play in the Outback Bowl to see if the old Jim Harbaugh is back. And I hope he is, because I agree with you that guy seems to get the best out of his team. And this year didn't get the best out of his team. We can look at any which way we want with youth and inexperience in the quarterback situation, but didn't get the best out of his team this year. And that's got to be his number one priority going forward here.
Shea Patterson, the rumors that, it's not rumors now, it's been confirmed he's going to visit Michigan this weekend for the UCLA game, the big non-conference home game with national television there, and it's Star Wars Day at Chrysler, and a lot of recruits are coming in. In fact, he may be part of a several-player contingent of former big-time recruits at Ole Miss that are looking to leave in the wake of the probation there that was further handed down by the NCAA last week. I'm trying my best. I listening to your show the last couple days, I have found myself spontaneously screaming at the gym with my headphones in and on the bench press. People look at me like, what's that dude's deal? I went home. One of your callers today prompted me to literally scream out from the shower. I got so frustrated. So I'm going to try and take a deep breath, recognizing we're all maize and blue brethren, faithful here, and there's a lot more that unites us than divides us, right? And I'm just going to ask a simple question. If Clemson, Alabama, and Ohio State had one quarterback returning whose entire experience consisted of 3.5 games on scholarship, and arguably the most recruited quarterback in the country from just 2 recruiting classes ago, wanted to drop right in your lap, would they say, no, we're going to develop our own guys? Hell to the no. And that's why they're Clemson, Alabama, and Ohio State. That's why we're not. And that's what we're paying Jim Harbaugh for us to become. And for the life of me, I don't get how anyone could watch the season we just endured with arguably the worst quarterbacking, not name Nick Sheridan and Stephen Threet, who at least had an excuse with the transition to a totally different offense than they originally came here for. That was the worst quarterbacking since Bo came to Michigan almost 50 years ago, and why anybody sits there and says, boy, I so enjoyed having our third-string quarterback play our 2 biggest games of the year that, hey, let's go into next season with 1 scholarship quarterback with any experience, and it's 3.5 games, and not take this 5-star guy. What? Michael, explain that to me. I don't understand that, Michael.
I don't have much of an explanation for it. In all fairness, I would say probably we got about 10 to 12 callers in the last 2 days, and the majority of them said bring Shea Patterson in. 2 people were kind of against it. One, Bob, we won't name his last name or tell you what his phone number was as he started to give it on the air, that thinks that Michigan – his argument was essentially that when you go back in the day, you would have Elvis Gerbach would get his 2 to 3 years, and then Todd Collins would get his 2 to 3 years, and then it was supposed to be Scott Dreisbach, but it came Brian Grease, he got his 2 years, and then John Navarre got, Drew Henson got, or I should say Tom Brady got 2 years, and then Drew Henson got a year, and then John Navarre got his 3 years, and then Chet Henne, and his whole argument was, well, if you recruit these quarterbacks with the promise of playing time, which no one really recruits them with the promise of playing time, they recruit them with the promise to compete for playing time. But if you bring these guys in, that each of these guys should get their 2 to 3 years to be the starting quarterback, that's what's fair to them. And I'm like you, Steve, when that caller, why
don't we go back and ask Tom Brady in 1998 if he thought he was dealt with fairly with Drew Henson taking his snaps as a true freshman. Why don't we go ask Scott Dreisbach, who returned in 1997, by the way, who was on the bench that whole season, losing his job to injury to Brian Grease. Why don't we ask him if he thought that was fair? What the hell is that?
I don't know. I was again, I don't have a dump button in my part of the studio, and I kept on doing this to my producer because I'm like, just cut this guy off. He's terrible. I have no idea what he's talking about. Just be done with him. If you can bring in Shea Patterson, a 5-star quarterback that has 10 games of starting experience, has thrown for 3,000 yards, has 27 touchdowns, all that experience, you bring him in because you're bringing back, let's face it, we have said this on this show. I get it all the time on social media. 2018 is the year. There's no more excuses. And if you want it to be the year, if you want to win a championship, then you go get a quarterback that can help you win a championship. It's that simple.
I think Jim making this move shows you he knows there's no excuses. I mean, at this time last year, Jarrett Stidham wasn't playing football. He actually tweeted, I'm looking forward to playing this weekend next year after he left Baylor with the scandal there. He went to a junior college, didn't play football, actually ran the scout team for the high school team in his community. Went to Auburn, and a year later he's in the SEC championship game, and they're ranked number 2 in the country. That's how much they had everything else. They had a couple of good running backs and Kerryon Johnson and Bretton Petway. They had an improving offensive line. They had an outstanding defensive front seven. The thing they never really had was a quarterback that could threaten the last couple of seasons since Nick Marshall left. They bring Jarrett Stidham in, and what happens? Gus Malzahn goes from you're fired to a 7-year extension. Okay? That's what happened.
Well, think about this, Steve. Think about this with transfers. The people that are like opposed to this idea of bringing in a transfer quarterback, if Michigan doesn't bring in a transfer quarterback 2 years ago, do they go 10-3?
No way.
God, no. They probably go 6-6, maybe 7-6 if they're lucky, if they don't have Jake Rudock. Last year, they obviously didn't need a transfer quarterback, but they did have John O'Korn start one game. Maybe they lose to Indiana if he's not there as a transfer quarterback. This year, well, you can make the argument, would you rather have had Dylan McCaffrey in the game or John O'Korn as a third-string guy? But still, they've benefited from the transfer quarterback. And now all of a sudden, we just want to give up on that. We want to pretend that. And here's the part that drove me nuts about it is his comment that, well, this is not what Bo would have done. And I wanted to be like, I wanted to drop the F word at that point because I wanted to be like, who the F cares what Bo would have done? And I'm not saying that to be disrespectful to Bo, like, because I think there's certainly the Bo's lasting lessons and the way that Jim coaches is very Bo-like. But This is 2017. This is not 1979. There's so many things that are different in the last 30, 40 years of college football that we can't compare to the Bo era. And what I try to get Bob, the caller, as I asked him about the fifth-year seniors, because if you're going to oppose essentially everything that Jim Harbaugh is doing, and he's trying to run Michigan essentially like an SEC program, and I don't mean that with the money that's being exchanged, but more like, okay, there's an advantage, if there's a loophole in the rules, I'm going to take advantage of it. If you want him to do that, then you can't oppose something like bringing in Shea Patterson. You can't oppose that when you get to a fifth year that you tell 75% of the eligible fifth-year seniors, I'm sorry, but you've got 4 years to graduate. You got 4 years to play, and now as a fifth-year senior, we're not tendering you a scholarship offer for this fifth year. Those are the things that you have to do to compete with, as you mentioned, Alabama and Clemson and Ohio State and Auburn and whoever else you want to throw out there. And so he's starting to do those things. And for me, I'm more for it because these kids are still getting a good education. He's still being a champion for them. In terms of their educational opportunities. Look what he did. Look what he's done with their spring break trips. Look what he's done with their educational opportunities. He's doing all those things, but he's trying to win a championship. If you're not interested in Michigan winning the championship in 2018 or 2019, then I don't ever like this whole idea of go cheer for somebody else. But if you really don't want Michigan to be like Alabama, to be like Clemson, to be like Ohio State, then I honestly think that your idea of what college football is now is a big disconnect from what you're cheering for. And you need to seriously ask yourself, if that's what you want, then why are you still so invested in FBS football at this point?
Two more quick things on this topic before we move on to the final one and let you go. Having watched Shea Patterson play a lot, elite level arm talent. I brought the Jarrett Stidham comparison because they're very similar. 5-star quarterbacks in high school. He's played a lot more than Jarrett Stidham. I mean, Stidham had very good stats at Baylor, but he started 3 games before he got hurt. He has 3 times more meaningful game action. Also, playing in the SEC, Patterson played a lot better defenses than what Jarrett Stidham was facing in the Big 12 Conference as well. Elite level arm talent, like Jarrett Stidham, not fast, but very quick, able to actually get out of the pocket, make plays with his feet, like we saw Jake Rudock bail Michigan out a lot on third downs 2 years ago. To me, you bring him in. And here's the other thing with Brandon Peters no one's talking about. Peters, I liked what I saw out of Peters. I think he could be really good. Peters is going to be a redshirt sophomore next year. He'll be draft eligible. He comes in and has a great season. He could very well go to the NFL, particularly at his size. Then we're having the same conversation again. We don't have any experience at quarterback. There are no really good arguments, none really, for not bringing Patterson in, because I think Jim also bringing him in eliminates any excuses at all. When you look at the rest of our roster, and even though there's a hole there at left tackle, but if Grant Newsome can fill it, we also have other kids that we recruited that we've developed over the last year or two that can maybe take that spot and at least be competent. I think the interior of our offensive line has a chance to be dominant. I think our defense is going to be pretty damn good again. I think our special teams will be really good, the kicking game, with another year with Nordine and Barrett Robbins. The only real issue is the biggest position of them all, quarterback. You bring a Shea Patterson in with what we've seen out of him and what his recruiting profile is, and a year after we see Jarrett Stidham transform Auburn and take them from 8-4 to playing for a spot in the playoff the last weekend of the season, Jim himself has to know. No excuses after this. To me, I think it's an excellent sign that he's doing this. He recognizes we ain't playing around anymore. I'm tired of this. We're not getting caught with our knickers down at the quarterback position ever again. This kid wants to land in my lap. I ain't looking a gift horse in the mouth. I don't care what kind of pressure this puts on me. We ought to be winning more than this. I think that's an excellent sign. That's the ruthlessness we were looking for when we hired him. I'm glad to see it back.
The other thing, too, and I think what changes this debate, Steve, for anybody that has the reservations, is if I would tell you that Shea Patterson's 4 other schools that he's considering are Penn State, Wisconsin, Michigan State, Ohio State, and Maryland, would people be like, no, we don't want him. Mm-hmm. We don't want him. We want to do it the old Michigan way, the old Bo way of bringing in quarterbacks and making these promises to these young recruits? No, absolutely not. It's still about a competitive thing. This kid is going to go somewhere. Now, maybe it's not to another Big Ten school, but if Michigan State makes the college football playoff next year in a hypothetical perfect world, and they end up having to play Shea Patterson, who is playing for Alabama or playing for USC or playing for Washington, are Michigan fan base not going to look back and be like, wow, we could have had that kid, but we didn't want him?
Yeah, I think if he comes, he's the most talented quarterback in the Big Ten for 2018, the day he arrives on campus. I really believe that. Let's fast forward here. One last topic before we let you go, the bowl game. I happen to think, given where our team is at, we got the best possible situation. A primetime slot, New Year's Day, the lead into the college football playoffs. It'll be a massive audience. We're the only Big Ten team playing that day. I've watched South Carolina several times this year. Very beatable opponent. Jake Bentley is a solid quarterback, but I like Don Brown's chances against quarterbacks that aren't going to beat you with their legs. He's mobile, but he doesn't like to run. He wants to stay in the pocket. Don Brown's resume against those kinds of quarterbacks is pretty salty. They don't have a great outside receiving threat. Their running game's kind of okay. Offensive line's not that great. Their defensive line, okay. Their linebackers, led by Sky Moore, are really good, but physically, I think we're a lot better than they are. I think we got about the perfect situation to spring, because I look at these bowl games now, unless you're in a New Year's Six game, essentially this is spring practice, and instead of an intra-squad scrimmage, you're playing another team. This is an excellent opportunity to springboard to 2018, and I go back to Georgia last year. 7-5, get into the Liberty Bowl. They win that game at 8-5 with a lot of guys coming back, and that's a huge springboard to them and what their offseason turned out to be, and the development of Jake Fromm and et cetera. And now we see them in the playoff. I think this is the perfect situation for us.
Well, I'll say this. I was trying to think if Michigan's played any opponent this year that equates to South Carolina. I think Penn State, Wisconsin, and Ohio State are all better than South Carolina. Maybe Michigan State. I think South Carolina is probably a little bit better than Michigan State, but Michigan lost to Michigan State. So for me, it comes down to this. This is another opportunity against a fringe top 25 team. This is a big game, a chance to slay some of those dragons, a chance to finish your season on a high note, a chance for you to go win a football game that in 2017 you showed an inability to win. And for me, that's a big part of this. Is like, for me I really, really, Steve, want to believe big time in 2018 as a chance to be really special for Michigan. And if I have to spend the entire offseason talking about what could be based off of just young talent and what they have coming back, and not with seeing something with my own two eyes, that's going to be hard to do. It's going to be harder to do at the very least. I want to have something in front of me that I can say, this is what we saw out of Michigan football this year, and this is why in this game the offensive line came together and played really well, and they got the running game going. Brandon Peters showed us some signs of what this passing game could look like. The defense locked it up and was rock solid. Special teams were good. I want that one thing, that one game, that one victory that we can go into the offseason and say, okay, you want to talk about 2018 potentially being very special? Mm-hmm. This game right here, everything was on the line. Michigan's healthy. Everybody's back. They had 4 weeks to prepare. Boom. Look what they just did against a good SEC team. That's what I want to see in this game.
Well said. Michael, thanks for joining us again this week. We appreciate it. God bless. Go Blue.
All right. Sounds good. I look forward to talking to you on my show this week, too. All
right. That's Michael Spath, the Michigan Insider, WTKA in Ann Arbor. When we come back here on Michigan Podcast, did the playoff committee actually get it right or not? We'll discuss next. A few years ago, the idea of the Big Ten being left out of something like the college football playoff, I'd have blown a gasket, right? But watching how this has essentially become the Buckeye 10, both in terms of its officiating and its television network, which is now essentially the Sports Information Department in Columbus, I really don't have any of that Big Ten homer shill left in me anymore, really. I'm at this point, unless it's really good for Michigan, I don't care. So that being said, though, there was no intellectual case to put Alabama in the playoff over Ohio State. What I mean by intellectual case, what I mean is objective criteria. If you look at the playoff committee's own criteria, Ohio State Conference Championship, check. More quality wins, check. They had 3 wins better than any wins Alabama had. In fact, Alabama has the weakest resume Of any team that's ever been admitted to the playoffs so far, they have no top 10 wins, and they didn't win their division or conference. Well, Steve, Ohio State didn't win their division or conference last year, but they had 3 top 10 wins: Wisconsin, and then which they beat on the road, Oklahoma on the road, and then the double overtime victory that was given to them. I'm sorry, where they defeated Michigan. Freudian slip. I'm sorry about that. So they had 3 top 10 wins last year, which is 3 more than Ohio State had this year. Well, Steve, Alabama's better statistically. Actually, Ohio State's the only team in the country to be in the top 10 in total defense and total offense. Well, Steve, Ohio State had that terrible loss to Iowa, which was a bad loss. Not that they lost to Iowa. Hell, we lose to them a lot too. But the 31-point margin was the problem. However, people forget that when Ohio State beat Michigan State by 45 points, that was one of the biggest wins a team's had over a ranked opponent all season long, which you would think would sort of cancel out the bad loss to Iowa. No, there is no intellectual case for Ohio State. All of the objective criteria that the committee laid out was all in Ohio State's favor. But that being said, my personal opinion is they chose the 4 best teams. Because here's what they did. They looked at the fact Michigan State didn't score in the playoff 2 years ago. Ohio State didn't score in the playoff last year. And they looked at the film of Alabama. They looked at the recruiting rankings and all the talent they have and how many of these injured linebackers are probably going to be healthy. And they probably asked themselves, didn't we just see Ohio State play Clemson last year? Do we really want to watch Alabama go blow Miami out in the Orange Bowl? And then we are concerned that Ohio State's not competitive with Clemson. And then all the heat we're going to take for that all off season. And I think that's what they chose Alabama for. I would caution anybody. So while they chose, I think, the 4 best teams, they did not choose the 4 most deserving teams. But I would caution anybody from making wide sweeping judgments about precedents being set here. Because I think if LSU, another big name in the SEC, or Auburn had the exact same resume as Alabama, no division or conference title and no top 10 wins, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The only statement that was made here was roll tide. They decided, hey, these guys have won 5 of the last 9 national titles. They've got the most talented team. We ranked them 1 or 2 every week of the poll, except this last one, we just think they're better than Ohio State. Essentially, they made a judgment call like you do when you're deciding who to draft in the NFL. You don't know for sure how someone will perform, and you just project what you hope is the most likely outcome, and that's what they did here. I don't think this is about, well, Ohio State had 2 losses. Auburn had 2 losses. They were number 2 in the country. If they had beaten Georgia, they'd be in the playoff right now. Well, they had a bad loss. Well, Ohio State had a bad loss to Virginia Tech at home by 2 touchdowns the year they won it. I really think it just came down to Ohio State's resume had enough question marks. See, I think if Wisconsin had won, they'd be undefeated. We wouldn't be having this conversation either. Ohio State's resume had enough question marks that they decided, we just think Alabama's better. And you're going to have to show us you're a lot better than Alabama for us to justify leaving them out of the playoff. I don't think they did this for money or ratings. In fact, I predict it will hurt their ratings. Now, the ratings will improve this year, I believe, because they're back on New Year's Day. But I think the improvement in their ratings will be hurt by the fact there's 2 SEC teams in there. When you look at the eyeballs in the Pac-12 and in the Big Ten, I mean, there's a lot of eyeballs in the Midwest and on the West Coast that are probably going to tune this out because they're not represented. So I don't think this is actually good for their bottom line at all. I don't think it's good for the ratings at all. I think they literally just did what they thought were the 4 best teams. And for that, even if I don't agree and you don't, we should applaud them because it means they set politics aside. I thought there was no way they'd ever call the most powerful commissioner in the Big Ten, Jim Delaney, and say, hey, we're leaving you out for a second SEC team, but they did. And props to Jim Delaney. He handled it like an adult on Saturday or on Sunday on ESPN. He made the case for the league, but, he didn't take any cheap shots, handled it maturely, the kind of leadership from adults that we don't see a lot in our culture today. And I thought he handled that with aplomb. This week's Twitter poll, no. Have we lost our balls? Are you kidding me? What kind of result is this? I asked you, when will Michigan finally make it to the Big Ten championship game in football? And 44% of you said you've given up ever making it. Come on, man. Get out. Burn your gear. You're not worthy of it. I know Michael Spath said earlier, I won't tell you to go root for another team. I will. I'm not as nice as him. And I'm pissed off about being 13-34 against Ohio State, so I'm already in a bad mood. Given up ever making it? Really? You know, this is Michigan podcast, not Detroit Lions podcast. You know, school with the most Big Ten titles of any. You've given up ever making it? Seriously? And this goes back to what I was talking to Spath about. People calling up, well, I don't really think we should take this 5-star quarterback from Ole Miss who's like way better than anybody we have. You know, we should pretend it's 1978 while everybody else kicks our ass. No. Well, I really wish Jim wouldn't respond back. You know, we should take the high road and just let, Mike D'Antonio plunger us, in the media every chance he gets. No. We don't do that here. And you can take your Bo revisionist history and stick that where the sun doesn't shine too. Because the Bo I grew up with kicked referees out of ever officiating at Michigan Stadium for fake fumbles in the Rose Bowl, lost his mind, threw his headsets. This idea that he stood over there like Pope Benedict, and we played our best every Saturday, and that's all we ask for here. But come on, no, he wasn't. Used to scream every week at practice, you're the worst lineman in the history of intercollegiate football. You'll never play it down here ever again, Jamie Morris. You fumbled once. Go ask the guys who played for him if he was Mr. Nice Guy. Come on, man. Come on. We're Michigan. Get your balls back. We're better than that. Giving up ever making it. You voted that way and you're not a troll. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Which brings us to our question of the week, which we love from our fans and viewers here at Michigan Podcast. Does the Big Ten being left out of the college football playoff increase the likelihood of expanding to 8 teams? Tons of you asked me this question. The answer is no. I think if and when, I'm not 100% sure that they will do it, because most of the people in power in college football don't want this to be an extra game. But the money may ultimately be too good. Like if Fox decides, we want to buy that package off of ESPN and now you have a full-out bidding war, the money could be so big that they can't say no to the 8th playoff team format. But Jim Delaney was adamant. He said, hey, I'm not going to be like many of our politicians where if I didn't get the result I wanted on Election Day, I'm like, let's just change the rules. I'm not doing that. So no, I think the Big Ten philosophically is against an 18 playoff, period. But ultimately the money from some networks, say Fox, may be so great in the next 10 years that it might be the incentive they have to ultimately decide they're going to do it. And it will be for that reason right here. It won't be for, you left my team out and now I'm upset. I don't think that'll do it at all. And that'll do it. Thanks for putting up with me being a little ornery this week because we're 13-34 against Ohio State. Thanks for tuning in here on Michigan Podcast. See you next week. Go Blue.